On a sultry August night in 1856, a strange event shook the religious heart of Charleston. Reverend Elijah Blackwood disappeared from his locked study in the city's largest church, leaving behind a blood-stained Bible and a mysterious handwritten note. The congregation demands sacrifice. The covenant must be kept. For more than a century and a half, the Charleston diocese buried the case deep in the dust of secret files, denying anyone access to the truth. But recently discovered letters have opened the floodgates of hell, a conspiracy so dark and far-reaching that it shook the very foundations of Southern society. So what really happened to the man who preached to senators and plantation owners alike? The answer was more than a disappearance. It was a ritual, hidden by the city's most powerful people. The investigation was deliberately sabotaged. Witnesses either died unexpectedly or disappeared without a trace. Evidence was systematically erased by the families who once controlled politics, finance, and the federal courts. Before we delve deeper into the darkness surrounding Reverend Blackwood and the terrifying secret that consumed Charleston's elite. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from. Maybe these secrets are lurking closer to home than you think. Return to Charleston in 1856. The city considered the crown jewel of the antebellum South. Cobblestone streets wind past grand mansions home to America's wealthiest families. The city thrived on rice cotton and a bloody reality slavery. This is a place where fame could save lives or send them crashing down. Though the air was fragrant with jasmine and magnolia, the stench of despair from the slave markets was everywhere. Church bells rang out interspersed with the cries of human beings for sale, a chilling chorus of virtue and crime. In the heart of the city, St. Augustine Church stood tall on Meeting Street. Its Gothic architecture rose like accusing fingers pointing to the sky. The church had been built in 1848 with donations from Charleston's most powerful families, the Vandergraaf's owners of vast rice plantations, the Millbrooks lawyers who helped write the state constitution, and the Witherells whose political influence stretched as far as Washington. Within its hallowed walls, backroom negotiations redraw congressional boundaries. Loveless marriages are arranged to consolidate multi-million-dollar fortunes. And here, secrets are buried deeper than any grave outside the old cemetery next to the church. The church seating was strictly divided by social rank. The front row was reserved for the descendants of the founding fathers, the middle for businessmen and intellectuals, and the back row for working-class people, or those who were not good enough to be known. The Reverend Elijah Blackwood had arrived in Charleston 3 years earlier from Richmond, Virginia. He brought with him honorary degrees and letters of recommendation from some of the most prominent families in the East. But his previous position at St. Elisha's Church in Richmond had ended abruptly with whispers of a scandal involving the daughter of a powerful family. The Diocese of Richmond seemed more than willing to send him away. The St. Augustine Board, though vague about his past, were captivated by his education and charisma. At 38, Reverend Blackwood was both a sharp intellect and a charisma that men respected and women were charmed. He was tall with piercing blue eyes, and his prematurely grey hair added to his worldliness. His voice had a southern aristocratic quality, but there was a fierceness to it that made even the most hardened slaveholders feel exposed. Every Sunday morning, the church was packed. The carriages lined up from Meeting Street to Broad Street. People came not just to pray, but to witness a man who seemed to touch both soul and power. Please ensure I'm not disturbed under any circumstances. Lock the main doors behind you and tell anyone who inquires that the church is closed for private contemplation. Sarah Beaumont had worked at St. Bartholomew's long enough to recognize when something was deeply wrong. Reverend Blackwood's usual poise had dissolved into a state of tightly wound agitation. His hands trembled faintly as he rearranged the papers on his desk, and his eyes, normally calm and commanding, darted toward the door like he expected someone to burst in at any moment. What unsettled Sarah the most, however, was the photograph. She'd seen it only once years ago, when the drawer hadn't latched fully. A faded daguerreotype of 13 men in formal attire standing in a semicircle around what appeared to be a stone altar. The image had haunted her since, and tonight, Reverend Blackwood had been staring at it, again frozen lost in thought, as if trying to draw strength or make peace with something unspeakable. At exactly 7:30 p.m. as church bells rang out across Charleston, calling worshippers to their evening devotions, 3 men arrived at St. Bartholomew's. Sarah, still in the vestry filing correspondence, recognized them instantly through the tall Gothic windows. Dr. Halston Rutledge, Judge Bernard Crenshaw, and Cornelius Fitzhugh, the tobacco magnate. Each of them a senior vestryman, each of them a name that carried weight across Charleston's social and political elite. And each of them tonight looked different. Their footsteps echoed in the nave, hesitant and heavy. They entered the church not as the confident titans of society they usually were, but as men burdened by something far greater than wealth or politics. Dr. Rutledge glanced behind him repeatedly, as though afraid he was being watched. Judge Crenshaw clutched a worn leather satchel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and Fitzhugh stoic, unshakable. Fitzhugh moved his lips silently, whispering what could only be desperate prayers. None of them acknowledged Sarah as they passed. They went straight to Reverend Blackwood's study. The heavy oak door thudded shut behind them with a dull finality that seemed to echo like a funeral bell through the empty church. For the next hour and a half, the silence was broken only by the muffled hum of intense conversation. Occasionally, a voice would rise, sharp, emotional, strained. These were not the tones of theological discussion or parish planning. These were voices on the edge. Around 8:40, Sarah heard it clearly. "You cannot ask this of us," Elijah Dr. Rutledge shouted. "Not after everything we've built. Not after all we've sacrificed to reach this point." Reverend Blackwood's reply was too low to catch completely, but the cold edge in his voice cut through the thick air. Sarah caught fragments. The covenant demands completion. The tithe was agreed upon. Your souls are already forfeit. A chilling silence followed. Then came Judge Crenshaw's voice, high-pitched, cracking. There must be another way. Surely the Lord would not demand such a sacrifice from his faithful servants. Blackwood's laughter followed a sound so alien, so hollow, that it made Sarah's skin crawl. It was not the laugh of a man, but something darker, something inhuman. The argument grew more heated. Fitzhugh's voice now joined the fray. Desperate. The yellow fever, it's already taken dozens. Let us say it was the pestilence. No one would question another death. But Blackwood would not yield. The covenant specifies the manner and the time. There can be no substitutions, no delays, no mercy. At 9:15 p.m., the door finally opened. The three men emerged, changed. Their faces were ashen, their steps uncertain. Judge Crenshaw struggled to light his pipe, dropping match after match with shaking hands. Fitzhugh couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder at the closed study door. He crossed himself repeatedly, but not with reverence, more like a man trying to ward off evil. Dr. Rutledge approached Sarah. His white coat was rumpled. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the night's cooling air. His medical bag, always at his side, seemed to sag with unfamiliar weight. "Miss Beaumont," he said, voice carefully measured as though rehearsed. "Reverend Blackwood will be working late this evening. Matters of utmost spiritual significance. He is not to be disturbed under any circumstances. You should go home now and ensure no one enters the church until morning prayers." The words were calm, but they didn't ring true. Rutledge's eyes wouldn't meet hers. As the three men disappeared into the Charleston night, their carriage wheels clattering over the cobblestones like distant thunder, a heavy silence fell over St. Bartholomew's. Sarah remained motionless in the vestry, unable to shake the feeling that something ancient and terrible had just awakened within those stone walls. A dread unlike any she'd ever known settled over the church like a shadow that had been waiting a very long time. The gas lamps lining the sanctuary flickered in their sconces, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to dance with sinister purpose across the stone arches and frescoed saints. These familiar symbols of comfort and faith now seemed to mock the very idea of sanctuary. The darkness no longer felt passive, it watched. Sarah remained rooted in the vestry for another 30 minutes, anxiety coiling tighter in her chest with every tick of the grandfather clock. Eventually, she summoned the last of her courage and crept toward the study for one final check. The door was still locked from the inside. A pale sliver of light bled from underneath, and from within came the faint rustling of pages, the deliberate scratch of a pen across parchment. She froze, straining to identify a voice. Reverend Blackwood's low and steady, though what he was saying didn't resemble any prayer she had ever heard. The language, harsh, foreign, almost inhuman, sent an involuntary shiver crawling down her spine. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't English. It was something else entirely. Something older. Pressing her ear gently against the thick oak door, she listened. Blackwood's voice rose and fell in strange cadences, chant-like, rhythmic, like an incantation performed in a theater of shadows. And then silence. Long, dreadful silences. Then again, voices. But more than one. Her breath caught in her throat. He was supposed to be alone. She had seen the others leave. And yet, she could hear them, distant, distorted, answering him in a call and response that grew louder, more fervent. A ritual was unfolding, and Sarah stood only inches away from its epicenter. The air near the door felt cold, unnaturally so. A bitter chill seeped from the cracks in the frame, chilling her hands and cheeks despite the thick heat of the August night. It was as though something inside the study was draining all warmth, all life from the very stones. Something was wrong, terribly, unutterably wrong, and Sarah Beaumont knew deep in her soul that whatever was taking place behind that locked door would change Charleston forever. The next morning would confirm her deepest fears, though the full scope of horror would take decades to unravel. Sarah arrived early to prepare the sanctuary for morning service. The study remained locked. She knocked gently at first, then harder, then with rising panic. No answer. She fetched Marcus Webb, the church's old sexton, a man who had served St. Bartholomew's for over 40 years. He was no stranger to death scandal or the dark corners of Charleston's history. But when his trembling hands unlocked the study door, nothing in his long life had prepared him for what they would find inside. Reverend Elijah Blackwood was gone as if he had simply ceased to exist. The windows were still latched from within. Thick shutters secured by iron bolts showed no signs of tampering. The door through which they had just entered had been locked from the inside. The key sat undisturbed on the desk, and yet the room was empty of life. What remained, however, would haunt Sarah and Marcus until their dying days. The desk, ornate mahogany. The centerpiece of the room held an open Bible at its center, its pages soaked in blood. The crimson had not dried, though an entire night had passed. It pooled in thick, deliberate smears across passages about sacrifice covenant and divine judgment. It didn't look accidental. It looked like emphasis. Next to the blood-stained scripture lay a note written in a hand Sarah recognized instantly as Blackwood's, but the ink was the same shade as the blood on the Bible. The congregation demands its sacrifice. The covenant must be honored. The 13 have become 12, but the work continues. The sight of it made Sarah reel backward, gasping. But the room held more horrors still. Every drawer in Blackwood's desk had been opened and emptied, not in the disordered rush of a burglary, but with precision. The contents had been arranged into neat piles across the Persian carpet letters, financial ledgers, and most disturbingly, a collection of sealed envelopes. Each envelope bore the name of one of Charleston's most powerful families' names etched onto banks, courthouses, and estates. The envelopes formed a perfect circle around where the desk chair should have been, but the chair was gone. In its place, a large, dark stain in the center of the circle. A stain Marcus recognized immediately as blood. Too much blood. Far too much for any person to lose and survive. The circular shape of the stain, eerily precise, suggested a ritualized act. As if someone had stood in that very spot, unmoving as their life was drained away with intention. Not struggle, not violence, surrender. Sarah's gaze was then drawn to the bookshelf behind the desk. Once lined with dusty theological volumes, now transformed into something else entirely. Arranged carefully along the second shelf, ceremonial implements. A silver chalice, clearly from the church's communion set, sat next to a dagger she had never seen before. The blade curved and ancient-looking bore smears of the same red substance that soaked the Bible and the carpet. The hilt carved from ivory was etched with symbols that meant nothing to Sarah, but somehow radiated dread. Even Marcus, usually stoic and slow to superstition, took a cautious step backward. His lips moved, forming silent prayers. In that moment, neither Sarah nor Marcus spoke aloud what they both already feared. Reverend Blackwood had not simply vanished. He had been taken by something ancient, something that fed on blood, secrecy, and power. And in his place, he had left a ritual, a warning, and a promise. The investigation that followed was swift, painfully so, and suspiciously contained. What should have sparked citywide scandal was instead methodically smothered by forces that reached well beyond Charleston's ancient streets. Judge Crenshaw personally assumed control of the inquiry. He claimed the matter required discretion due to the sensitive nature of Reverend Blackwood's spiritual duties and the need to preserve the confidentiality of his pastoral counsel. Few questioned the decision, though many raised eyebrows at his insistence on bypassing external authorities. Dr. Halston Rutledge, despite his involvement the night before, was quietly appointed as the acting medical examiner. The fact that there was no body to examine did not seem to matter, nor did the obvious conflict of interest. Within days, an official conclusion was announced. Reverend Elijah Blackwood had suffered a mental collapse, supposedly brought on by the oppressive August heat and the heavy spiritual burden of tending to Charleston's upper echelons during a time of political unrest. The blood, a severe nosebleed, said to be the result of dehydration and stress. His sudden disappearance attributed to a pressing family emergency in Virginia, one that required immediate private travel and complete secrecy. The story released to the Charleston Mercury was even more sanitized. The Reverend had received urgent news that his elderly mother was gravely ill. He had departed in haste to be at her bedside. His personal effects would follow shortly, and a suitable replacement would be appointed in due time. Until then, church operations would proceed under the steady guidance of the vestry, but those closest to the events knew better. Marcus Webb, the old sexton who had opened the study door that morning, confessed in hushed tones to his wife that he had never seen grown men so frightened in his entire life. The vestry members, those same powerful men who once carried themselves like kings, now looked hunted. Dr. Rutledge aged a decade in a week. His once jet-black hair turned ashen grey nearly overnight. He cancelled appointments, shuttered his practice, and muttered to himself during long sleepless walks through the city. Judge Crenshaw, once the embodiment of legal precision, was spotted stumbling out of taverns on East Bay Street in the early morning hours, slurring about prices paid and covenants fulfilled. He took to drink with the desperation of a man trying to drown something far more potent than guilt. As for Sarah Beaumont, despite 15 years of loyal service, she was politely but firmly urged to take an extended leave to recover from the trauma. When she returned a month later, the locks on her office had changed. Her desk and records were gone. A new secretary, a quiet young woman from Columbia, had replaced her. This newcomer knew nothing of the events surrounding Reverend Blackwood and had been instructed never to ask about the church's past or her predecessor. Perhaps most damning of all was what became of the three men who had stood with Reverend Blackwood on that final night. One by one, they vanished from Charleston's elite as if their very names had become cursed. Dr. Rutledge announced he had accepted a position in Richmond, citing his wife Margaret's fragile health and the need for a more suitable climate. Within days, he sold his practice and family home, both at considerable losses. He left behind expensive medical instruments, unpaid staff, and the heavy hush of unanswered questions. Judge Crenshaw shocked the legal community by resigning from the bench after 25 years. He claimed exhaustion and a desire to spend his remaining years on his family's plantation in Georgia. His abrupt retirement caused widespread disruption. Important cases left unresolved, legal proceedings thrown into chaos. But it was Cornelius Fitzhugh who made the most dramatic exit. He sold the Fitzhugh Tobacco Empire, a company built over 3 generations, for a mere fraction of its worth. Within a week, he vanished entirely. Rumors swirled. Some said he had sailed for California. Others whispered of South America. None were confirmed. He left behind a grieving wife, bewildered children, and creditors banging on the doors of an empty estate. No letters, no explanation, only silence. And as summer faded into a strange, uneasy autumn, the church changed. St. Bartholomew's once grand halls now carried an echo, a presence that hadn't been there before. Lights flickered. Doors creaked open without cause. Cold drafts whispered down stone corridors sealed for decades. And in the neighborhood that surrounded the church, strange things began to stir. The man chosen to replace Reverend Blackwood arrived with trembling hands and too many questions. Jonathan Pierce was a fresh-faced minister from North Carolina, eager but visibly unsettled from the moment he first stood at St. Bartholomew's pulpit. Within days, he began to speak carefully, at first of feeling watched, not by the congregation but by something else. Eyes that were never visible, yet always present. Judging, listening, waiting. He wrote in his journal now, preserved in a church archive, that during sermons he could feel a weight pressing down on him as though the air itself was thick with judgment. In Reverend Blackwood's former study, the temperature defied explanation. At times, it would drop so suddenly that frost would bloom across the windows in the peak of a low-country summer. Parishioners began whispering stories of their own. Some felt icy cold patches drifting past them during prayer, moving as if guided by invisible hands. Others reported hearing faint murmurs, unintelligible voices speaking from empty pews. The most unsettling accounts came from those who claimed they could feel warm breath on their necks during moments of silent reflection, only to turn and find no one there. Perhaps the most bizarre mystery came in the form of the church's finances. Every month, without fail, an anonymous cash donation would appear in the offering box, matching exactly the amount once paid to Reverend Blackwood as salary. No donor could be identified, no pattern traced. Each envelope bore a note written in an elegant looping script that many quietly admitted looked disturbingly like the Reverend's own handwriting. No explanation was ever found, and so time passed. The decades dulled Charleston's memory, and the whispers became shadows. The name Elijah Blackwood was quietly erased from the church's history, his portrait removed, his name struck from vestry records, but secrets, especially the kind soaked in blood and guilt, don't stay buried forever. Let me ask you this. What happens when the walls that hide our sins finally crack? In the winter of 1889, 33 years after that awful August night, the silence was shattered. It began innocently enough, a renovation. Contractors had been hired to modernize the Rutledge family mansion on South Battery, one of Charleston's grandest homes. Dr. Edmund Rutledge had died nearly 2 decades earlier, and the house had passed through several hands. No one suspected what lay behind the study's northern wall until a worker's hammer struck something hollow. Behind a false panel, hidden with stunning craftsmanship, was a sealed compartment untouched for more than 30 years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed against moisture and time, lay a bundle of documents, letters, photographs, financial ledgers, and secrets powerful enough to burn Charleston to the ground. What the workers had found wasn't just a cache of private correspondence, it was a vault of sin, preserved like relics, protected like confession. The letters detailed a network of blackmail, extortion, and political manipulation orchestrated by none other than Reverend Elijah Blackwood himself. He hadn't been just a preacher, he'd been a spider at the center of a far-reaching web spinning silken traps around some of the South's most powerful men: Charleston, Richmond, Washington, even New Orleans. Thornfield had kept meticulous records, handwritten letters in his signature refined style. Not sermons or spiritual notes, but cold calculations, precise threats, information gathered over years, secrets of affairs, illegitimate children embezzled funds, whispered affiliations with abolitionist causes, and darker still. One letter stood out, dated August 15, 1856. Just 8 days before Blackwood vanished, it was addressed to Edmund Rutledge himself. Its tone was not pastoral. It was sharp, commanding, dangerous. My dear Edmund, your continued resistance to our arrangement is both disappointing and dangerous to all involved. You know what I possess. You know what would happen if it were revealed. I have been patient. That patience is nearing its end. What arrangement did he mean? And why did it end in silence, blood, and an empty study? We're only beginning to scrape away the rot behind Charleston's polished veneer. And what lies beneath might explain why so many left in haste and why none of them ever dared return. The letter to Dr. Edmund Rutledge was far more than a threat. It was a blade pressed to the throat of Charleston's elite. The photographic evidence I possess of your visits to the Magnolia Street establishment. It read, would not only end your medical career in disgrace, but may also shatter dear Margaret's fragile constitution. And as for your involvement in the opium shipments smuggled in through Charleston's Chinese quarter, well, I imagine federal authorities would be far less sympathetic than I have been. Senator Barnwell has accepted our terms regarding the Western land appropriations. Judge Crenshaw understands the necessity of favorable outcomes in the Morrison slave revolt trials. I trust you will adjust your position on the yellow fever medication supplies and the arrangements we discussed. The Lord's work requires sacrifice, and the covenant demands completion. Your soul and the souls of your companions depend on it. It was signed simply E.T. This wasn't ordinary blackmail. This was something else. The letter confirmed the immense scope of Reverend Elijah Thornfield's scheme, but it also hinted at a far more unsettling truth. The references to a covenant to eternal souls to sacrifice this was not just political leverage. It sounded like religion, twisted into something ritualistic, something occult. Then came the ledger. Bound in dark leather, brittle with age, the book catalogued over 40 names. Respected men of Charleston, each paired with coded entries, crimes. Sins, the exact amounts they paid to keep those sins hidden. The pages were a gallery of corruption. BR. Cotton futures manipulation via federal contacts. 500-month. HC. Jury. Tampering in capital cases. 300-month guaranteed discretion. PM. Slave breeding documentation and trafficking records. Ongoing protection arranged. WS. Federal postal fraud revenue splitting confirmed. But the money wasn't simply being hoarded. It was being funneled into something called the Sacred Works Fund. That's where the story darkens into something truly horrifying. Meticulous entries detailed purchases of rare ritual materials, ceremonial clothing, and most disturbingly, expenses listed under the term participant acquisition. Tucked between those pages was a folded document, a membership roster. The title read, The Covenant of Solomon. 13 names were listed. At the top, Elijah Thornfield, High Priest and Master of Ceremonies. The other 12, Dr. Edmund Rutledge, Judge Alistair Crenshaw, Cornelius Fitzhugh, and then the truly shocking names, Senator Robert Barnwell, Federal Judge William Manning, Mayor Patrick Hennessy of Charleston, and others, some whose descendants still held power in Charleston well into the 20th century. Beneath the names, a motto was inscribed in both English and Hebrew. Through sacrifice, we achieve dominion. Through dominion, we achieve immortality. Through immortality, we transcend the laws of God and man. The document was dated 1854, just 2 years after Thornfield arrived in Charleston. That meant he hadn't merely stumbled into this power, he had planned it. He spent years identifying vulnerable men, exploiting secrets whispered in the safety of confessionals or discovered through his growing web of informants. Next to each name was a brief notation, initiated via Morrison trial confessions, bound through evidence of federal contract fraud, secured through photographic documentation. Thornfield wasn't just blackmailing them. He was binding them to him, to each other, to something else with secret shame and a shared darkness that no man could escape alone. And then came the most disturbing piece of all, a floor plan. At first glance, it appeared to be a blueprint of Charleston's old slave market, once a bustling center of commerce. But beneath the familiar layout were hidden levels, an entire network of chambers concealed below ground. Each room marked with dates, cryptic symbols, and words that turned the stomach. Subjects acquired: 3/12, 1855. Ceremony complete: 4/21, 1856. Covenant obligations fulfilled. These weren't storage rooms. They weren't holding cells. They were places of ritual, according to the ledger, the public face of the slave market, the auctions, the records. The overseers was just a cover. Below, hidden beneath layers of brick and stone, something darker had been built, maintained, used. Let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what kind of power requires sacrifice to sustain? What kind of men believe that dominion grants immortality? And if such a covenant was formed, who or what was it made with? The final entry in Thornfield's ledger was dated August 20th, 1856, just 3 days before his sudden disappearance. It contained only 9 words. Final sacrifice prepared. Covenant completion scheduled. The master's hour approaches. Whatever Thornfield had set in motion, it was clear he believed it was coming to an end or reaching its final fulfillment. But it would not end quietly. Decades later, a woman named Martha Rutledge, granddaughter of Dr. Edmund Rutledge, stood in the shadow of that legacy. She was in her early 60s when she discovered the sealed collection hidden within the family mansion. Her hands trembled not just from age, but from the realization of what she held. Growing up, she had heard whispers of her grandfather's final years, tales told in hushed voices over whiskey and storm winds, how he had withdrawn from society how the family referred to his disappearance from public life as a period of religious reflection. Some even said he'd gone mad. Now she knew better. The torment that had followed her family for generations. The unexplained illnesses, the recurring nightmares, the fear of mirrors and closed doors suddenly made sense. And just when it seemed the story couldn't grow darker, it did. If you've made it this far, you already feel the weight of what's unfolding. Take a moment. Share the story with someone who craves the eerie and the unexplained. Like, subscribe and stay with us. What happens next might be the most unsettling part of all. Martha did what many in her position would not. She brought the entire collection ledger letters, diagrams, all of it, to her attorney, Charles Peyton. Peyton was a man hardened by scandal. Discreet, methodical, and trusted by Charleston's oldest families, he had spent decades quietly managing the sins of the city's elite, from embezzlement and infidelity to hushed-up crimes that never made the papers. But what Martha showed him stopped even his hands from moving. He reviewed the papers for 3 days in silence, rarely leaving his office. When he finally called her back, he didn't mince words. "Burn them," he said, his voice low. "Burn them and forget this ever happened." She stared at him, stunned. "These secrets," he added, "are older than you. Older than your guilt. Older than justice. Your grandfather's sins are beyond redemption, and the men he served are long dead. If you reveal this, you destroy descendants who never asked for the curse they inherited." But Martha Rutledge had more courage than Edmund ever did. Despite Peyton's pleas and even her own family's desperate attempts to convince her otherwise, she refused to bury the past again. Instead, she transferred the entire collection to the Charleston Historical Society under one condition: the materials would remain sealed for 50 years. "Let the truth sleep until the world is ready," she said. But what Martha couldn't have known was that this single act of defiance would unlock far more than family shame. It would crack open a conspiracy that had infected Charleston like a spiritual plague. 4 years later, in 1893, the past came clawing out of the ground. Construction crews were clearing the ruins of the old Charleston slave market, which had been shuttered since the end of the Civil War. For 30 years, the building had stood empty, decaying in the heat and damp of the Carolina coast. It was finally scheduled to be demolished to make way for a new municipal building. But the workmen found something no blueprint had predicted. Beneath the surface, hidden below the stone floors, was an underground complex. Carved directly into the native rock, bricked over with meticulous care, these chambers were unlike anything found under typical commercial structures. They weren't cellars, they weren't storage, they were something else entirely. The walls were stained. Not water, not mold, but something darker. Something that made seasoned men freeze in place. Blood, not spatter, not droplets, but pools. Evidence of repeated, deliberate violence. Iron rings were still bolted into the stone. Shackles hung from them, their metal worn smooth by years, decades of struggle. And then, in the deepest chamber, among broken stone and decaying wood, the discovery that confirmed every fear: a small box. Inside, a gold pocket watch, the initials engraved on the back E.T., and beneath it, an inscription in Latin, Tempus Mortis, time of death. The gold pocket watch recovered from the chamber, engraved Tempest Mortis, was quickly identified by several elderly parishioners at St. Bartholomew's Church. They remembered it well. That was Reverend Thornfield's, one old woman whispered. He checked it constantly, always fidgeting with it like he was waiting for something. It had become something of a morbid joke among the congregation. During his final sermons, Thornfield and his ticking timepiece. Now, the joke was over. Also recovered a silver communion chalice, tarnished and grotesquely stained. The city's medical examiner, after a single inspection, refused to publicly identify what the cup contained. In his official report, the substances were listed simply as organic residue. But the most chilling artifact was visual. A set of daguerreotype photographs perfectly preserved in a tin case. The images were grainy but unmistakable. 13 men standing in ceremonial robes. At the center of the frame, an altar made entirely of human bones. Let that sink in. If you've ever wondered what a city might do to keep secrets like this from surfacing, you're about to find out. The city's reaction was swift and telling. Mayor Thomas Bennett, whose family name had appeared in the now infamous Rutledge documents, personally issued the order to seal the chambers permanently. No formal investigation, no public report, no arrests. Instead, concrete was poured day and night, filling the underground structure completely. Within 6 months, the Charleston Municipal Building rose atop the sealed site like a tombstone placed by the guilty. But the workers hadn't been silenced, and concrete doesn't erase memory. Soon the rumors were everywhere, from dockyards to laundries, taverns to parlor kitchens. Charleston's working class whispered like a wind through cracked shutters. The most vocal among them was Thomas McKenna, an Irish stoneworker who had helped uncover the subterranean nightmare. Before the job, McKenna had been known as a reliable, sober tradesman. But after the excavation, he took to drink hard and to talk even harder. At waterfront taverns, between sips of cheap whiskey, he began to tell his story. I've seen fire in Boston, disease in New York, but nothing like what I saw in that place. McKenna described the underground layout in disturbing detail. A chamber dim and damp, chains, blood, symbols carved into the brick, and then 13 bodies, black and white, arranged in a perfect circle, like they was praying. But this weren't no prayer meeting. He'd pause there, his hands shaking, struggling to light a cigarette. The way they was laid out, what was done to them, it was evil. Worse than anything I ever heard of, even in stories, meant to scare you straight. Most might have dismissed McKenna's rants as the ravings of a drunken laborer until he said something no one outside the Rutledge circle should have known. 12 victims in a circle, he said. But the 13th, he weren't murdered. He was the one who welcomed it. The preacher, he was in the center. Robes black as sin. Hands folded like he was waiting on the devil himself. And he died, smiling. Then he would lean in, whispering now, his voice cracking. The knife was still in his hands. McKenna's description aligned exactly with the membership list found in Dr. Rutledge's documents. 13 men, Reverend Thornfield at the center, Only this wasn't just murder. It was ritual. Thornfield, it seemed, had orchestrated his own death as the final act of a long, deliberate, and deeply spiritual horror. But why had he convinced 12 of Charleston's most powerful men to volunteer for this dark finale? Or had he manipulated, blackmailed, or drugged them, turning them into pawns in his last ceremony? And if Thornfield had conducted ritual killings, how many more victims had never been found? Charleston had long buried its poor, its enslaved, its vanished. Had these forgotten souls become fuel for something no church would dare name? As the whispers turned into open suspicion, an underground network of dock workers, freedmen, and house staff began collecting records comparing stories. And what they uncovered next was a pattern. Let's pause here for a moment. What would you have done in Martha's place? Destroy the documents or protect the truth, even if it meant exposing your own bloodline? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The most terrifying discoveries are still to come. It was once believed that Reverend Thornfield had mysteriously disappeared in the summer of 1856. But the truth, as the final confession of a man held in silence for nearly half a century, reveals is darker than any theory has ever been put forward. Not missing, not murdered, but voluntarily dying in a ritual so gruesome it would shatter the soul of those who witnessed it. In the final days of 1901, Samuel Fletcher, a frail old night watchman at the old slave market, lay dying in a Charleston poorhouse. He was terminally ill with tuberculosis, but it was not the physical pain that shook him, but the guilt which had piled up over the years like dust over a deadly secret. Have you ever heard of last words? Some people die peacefully, and others like Fletcher die with a piece of hell buried in their chests. He whispered his last words to Father Patrick McGrath, a priest known for his compassion and unwavering faith in redemption. For 3 long nights, amid the coughing and groaning of dying souls around him, Fletcher opened the door to a piece of history sealed in cement and silence. In the summer of 1855, Fletcher was approached by a powerful man in town, Dr. Rutledge. For a salary of $50 a month, a sum far exceeding the wages of skilled craftsmen. At the time, Fletcher was asked only one thing: to unlock the basement of the slave market at night and make sure no one else could see what went on inside. At first, he thought it was an illegal slave trade, cruel but common. He dared not question it because the money paid for his wife's medicine and sent his children to school. But later he realized he should have asked. What he saw over the next year was nothing like what a normal soul could endure. Fletcher witnessed at least 37 people murdered in rituals that were organized like a dark religion, complete with black robes, masks, daggers, and ritual readings in languages he described as chilling. Though the members always hid their faces, Fletcher gradually learned who was who. Rutledge always carried a medical bag, checking the victims' pulses before and after the ritual. Fitzhugh arrived with a wooden box containing the ritual tools. And one person in particular always appeared last in elaborate robes with strange symbols, Thornfield himself. Remember those descriptions of the silver cup and leather book found in the concrete-filled basement? Now we know they weren't props. They were tools for the most unholy ritual ever performed in Charleston. Each ritual had a purpose. Fletcher said not just to kill, but as he described it, to take something deeper than blood or flesh, a kind of soul. But the final night August 23rd, 1856, was different. It was the night Thornfield himself became the final offering. No arrests, no resistance. He entered as the leader of his own funeral procession, preaching a sermon not to God, but to some power he believed was listening beneath the ground of Charleston. By killing him in the proper manner, he said the remaining 12 members would be forever bound to his soul and thus gain eternal dominion over the soul and body of the city. Fletcher hiccuped in a fever, whispering to Father McGrath. They called themselves the 12, but not saints. They were the 12 devils, and the 13th was their king. One by one they came forward, holding their ceremonial daggers. Each thrust was an oath, a cement block sealing their consciences, and perhaps the fate of the city. What do you think happened next? Thornfield died with a smile on his face. His hand still held the dagger, as if he had performed the final part of the ritual himself. And the rest, they emerged from the cellar as if they had just blessed themselves, not baptized, but washed their hands of blood. But as we all know, blood cannot be washed away. Fletcher's confession was never made public. Father McGrath recorded it in his diary until after they were both laid to rest. But now, you and I, we've listened to it together. If that gives you the chills, well, maybe a part of Charleston is listening with us. One thing the audience needs to understand. The Reverend did not disappear mysteriously. He killed himself in a ritual designed to bind his followers to collective guilt and bind their souls to him through the ultimate act of depravity. According to Samuel Fletcher's confession delivered in ragged breaths over 3 nights as he struggled with death, he was approached by a man named Dr. Arlen in the summer of 1855. In exchange for his silence and night guard service in the underground warehouse of the Charleston slave market, Fletcher was paid $50 a month, a sum well above the wages of the city's best craftsmen at the time. Initially, Fletcher thought he was aiding an illegal slave trade that was enough to make his conscience prick him. But the reality was far more sinister. From early 1855 until that fateful night in August 1856, Fletcher witnessed at least 37 premeditated murders, each one elaborate, gruesome, and increasingly depraved. The members of the secret society wore black robes and masks. But over time, Fletcher began to recognize them by their voices, their habits, their gait. Dr. Allen always carried a medical bag and checked his victims' pulses. Another Judge Calderon always had a file that seemed to record the history of each victim. And Cornelius Van Acker, a wealthy aristocrat, carried a wooden box containing ritual implements. And at the center of all the rituals, one man, Rabbi Elijah Thorne. He appeared only last in robes embroidered with strange symbols, carrying an ancient leather book. As he read, the very air in the cellar seemed to thicken with fear. What Fletcher had witnessed was no longer simple murder. They were not just taking lives, he said, eyes wide, but harvesting something else. Not blood, not flesh. Something deeper, something more vile. In every ceremony, the victim's blood was collected in silver chalices and members were forced to drink it as a ritual in their covenant. But on the night of August 23, 1856, it was unlike any other. This time, Reverend Thorne himself was the offering. He was not forced, he volunteered. He stood on an altar made of human bones, preaching a demented mass in which he claimed that his death would open the door for those who remained immortality, dominion, and power beyond both law and divinity. Then one by one, the 12 remaining members of the secret society stabbed him in the heart with their ceremonial knives. Each thrust was an incantation, and each word made the vault vibrate as if something in the real world responded. But Thorn did not scream. He laughed, a satisfied laugh as if he were seeing something greater than this world. His last words were, "Through my death you are granted immortality. Through this sacrifice I break the boundary between God and man. From now on you and I are forever bound in darkness." After the final ritual, the group of 12 arranged the Reverend's body with the bodies of his previous victims, forming a symbol that matched the carvings in the vault. They left, scattered, never to meet again. But from that moment on, they were bound together forever and to the promise of death. The scariest part, folks, may not be the rituals themselves, but the consequences that have lasted to this day. The story continues, and the next installment will show how Thornfield's promise of immortality has wreaked terrible havoc on future generations. Do you think the curse really exists, or is it just a terrible coincidence of history? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And we'll see you in the next installment where all the masks will be stripped away. In the years since the final rites, Reverend Thornfield's name has never been mentioned publicly. But as is often the case in history's darkest tales, the curse he cast did not die with him. It merely took on new form. Father McGrath, the priest who discovered Samuel Fletcher's diary, did more than turn it over to the Baltimore Catholic Church and seal it for 50 years. He began a secret journey, using his church connections to track down the descendants of the 12 Covenanters. What he found was beyond his wildest imagination. The Arlens descended from the doctor who performed the rites, became one of the most prominent medical families in the American South. They founded hospitals, owned pharmaceutical companies, and invested in biotechnology. But in every generation, at least one person, usually the patriarch, has fallen into a state of schizophrenia by age 33. They all complain of whispers in the dark and appearances by men in black. The Calderons, with their strong legal pedigree, have produced governors, justices, and even a Supreme Court nominee. But records compiled by Father McGrath show that they have always died on August 23rd, either by freak accidents or by sudden death in their sleep. A medical examiner once said their hearts were 40 years older than their actual ages despite their healthy bodies. The Van Ackers' wealthy merchants had extended their trading empire from Charleston to Liverpool and then to the Far East. They lived lavishly, attending every high society party. But according to internal bank records that McGrath had access to, their fortunes always skyrocketed in September each year, even though no transactions were recorded. And then, a generation later, each heir disappeared on the same moonless night, without a trace. Do you believe in coincidence? Or is there something beyond the laws of nature that we simply don't dare name? In a handwritten report McGrath wrote, never officially published, he described a series of similar occurrences among the families involved. Footsteps in the middle of the night without any source. Children in the house drawing the same strange symbol on the wall without being taught. The clock stopped at the same time, 3:16 a.m. And always, someone in the family lost their minds. After reading a letter signed exactly like Thornfield's. In 1902, just as the seal on Fletcher's diary was about to expire, a young priest from Baltimore was sent to re-examine the documents. But when he opened the book, it was blank. Every page was clean as if it had never been written on. Except for one last line written in a completely different handwriting, the truth is not hidden. It is only waiting for the right moment to be summoned. If you're a research person, try searching Charleston's historical records for names like Arlen Calderon Van Acker. You might find something or someone still out there. Wait. Over the years, Father McGrath became increasingly haunted by a question. Did Reverend Thornfield's spirit really vanish with his body? Or did the 1856 ritual unleash something more terrible than life? In 1911, a silent copy of Liber Nocturnum, the ritual book Fletcher had described, appeared for sale in a used bookstore in New Orleans. There was no author's name, no publisher, and when the buyer took it home, the last page had been slashed in half, leaving only the lower half of the inverted star symbol burning. The buyer was a young scholar, Lucas Dunning, who was studying Southern folklore. In his diary, the last page read, "I have been to Charleston. I have seen the cellar under the old market. It is not only the scene of the crime, it is the gate." August 22, 1912. The next day, Lucas disappeared. His body was never found. In 2006, while renovating the basement of an old Broad Street bar, workers discovered a poorly plastered stone wall. After chiseling it out, they found an ancient metal door sealed with red wax with a symbol of 12 circles intertwined around a dagger. No one dared to open the door. Instead, the bar owner called in a research team from the College of Charleston. Among them was a symbology professor named Rachel Ferro, who later told the local news, "We found a room built of limestone, probably from the 18th century. On the wall were 13 tattoo-like symbols arranged in a circle. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and the blood had long since turned black. Everything was documented and locked away, because no one wanted to be held responsible for what the authorities called a structure of undetermined archaeological value." But 3 months later, one of the students who had been on the expedition, a girl named Eliza Crow, jumped off the 12th floor of the dormitory. In her coat pocket, they found a scrawled page. "I dream of him every night. He calls my name in a language that is not of this world." August 23, and now you're hearing this story. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. Do you feel anything? Just a slight, just a chill. Like someone standing right behind you. Because the curse doesn't end when Thornfield dies. It just changes its bearer. Some believe that if you hear enough of the story, understand all 13 symbols, know the right name, pronounce the right final phrase, then Thornfield's spirit will know you. And as he promised, we are bound by blood and darkness until the end of time. If tonight you dream of a man in a black cloak, do not call his name, do not listen to his invitation, and never open the door. You're listening to Sleepy History Tales, where history isn't just retold, it's relived. If you find this story creepy, leave a comment below. Do you think Thornfield is really dead, or has someone replaced him? And if you've ever been to Charleston, Let me know. Do you hear anything underground?